If you had told 20-year-old me that one day I'd be sitting behind a microphone, talking thoughtfully about sex and hookup culture and the emotional consequences of it all, I would have laughed in your face. Like, literally laughed in your face. And then probably said something along the lines of, "Oh, please, just relax. It's not that serious." Because in my 20s, I really thought I had it all figured out. I thought being chill with casual meant being mature. I thought detachment was strength. And I thought anyone who thought the things I'm about to talk about with you about sex was either dramatic or insecure or just way too damn uptight. Fast forward a few years or 15, and here I am, very much doing the most with opinions and perspective and a completely different understanding of what sex actually costs, especially for us as women. And no, this isn't me turning into the fun police. So please calm down. Don't freak out. I didn't wake up one day and decide to hate hookup culture or pretend I don't understand why it exists. I get it. Trust me, I lived it. I defended it and I benefited from it until I didn't. Because somewhere between this is casual and why do I feel so weird about all of the things that are happening, something started clicking. Not in a judgmental way, but in a wait. Why does this keep affecting me more than I expected kind of way? So, welcome back to Chasing Stability, where today we're talking all about the cost of sexuality. Not to shame you or it, not to romanticize waiting, and definitely not to pretend sex isn't fun or exciting or meaningful, but to be honest about the part nobody really prepared us for: the emotional weight, the attachment, the confusion, and why so many of us women quietly change our stance as we get older, even when we swore we never would. But let's stop right here before we go any further, just real quick. I just want to say this flat out and plainly. This episode isn't about telling you what you should do with your body. It's about finally naming something a lot of us felt but didn't have language for at 22. And that's it. And hopefully, it's also about helping younger girls avoid some of the confusion so many of us had to stumble through on our own because nobody warned us. Nobody warned us about the emotional math. Nobody explained how something can be consensual and exciting and still leave you feeling almost broken inside or just feeling off afterwards. And how no strings attached sometimes does come with strings. The ones that you don't notice until you're already tangled in them way further than you ever thought you'd be. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you're human. At some point, a lot of us stop asking, "Is this fun?" and start asking, "Why does this keep messing with my peace? Why does something that's supposed to feel empowering sometimes end up chipping away at confidence instead? Why does detachment start to feel less like freedom and more like an armor that you've started to put on?" And that's really what today's episode is all about. Not shaming our younger selves, not pretending desire is bad, but being completely honest about how our relationships with sex evolve as we evolve. And why realizing sex isn't the foundation of a stable relationship doesn't mean you've changed for the worse. Most of the time, it means you've finally learned what actually sustains you. And that's not a bad thing. When I think about how I used to see sex versus how I see it now, the difference is honestly black and white. Because then sex felt like proof that I was wanted, proof that I was chosen, proof that I was desirable or interesting, fun enough to keep around. It wasn't something I would have admitted out loud back then, but a lot of my confidence was definitely tied to whether someone wanted me in that way. Sex felt like chemistry. It felt like connection. It felt like being close without having to ask for closeness, if that makes sense. And for a while, I guess that worked for me, or at least I thought it did back then. Because when you're younger, sex can feel like the whole relationship. It feels like intimacy, like bonding, like security, even when none of those things are actually there yet. So you mistake access for closeness, you confuse desire with depth, and you convince yourself that if someone wants you physically, they must care in some way that counts, right? How could they not? But now I see sex very differently. Now I see it as something that amplifies what's already there, not something that creates it. It doesn't build safety. It doesn't create consistency. It doesn't create relationships. It doesn't make someone show up better for you. It just magnifies whatever foundation already exists. And that shift didn't come from becoming colder or less fun or more moral. It came from paying attention to me, from noticing how often sex made me feel bonded to people who weren't bonded to me, how often it kept me emotionally invested in situations that weren't actually investing back, how often it blurred my clarity instead of strengthening it. Now, sex feels less like the starting point, more like an addition, right? Something meaningful when it's rooted in trust, something connecting when there's emotional safety already underneath it all, something that enhances love but cannot replace it. And realizing that didn't make life smaller, it made it way more clear. Because once sex stopped being the center of the connection, I started seeing relationships for what they actually were, not what the chemistry made me hope they'd become. And I think that's why hookup culture worked for me when I was younger, because of how I already viewed sex. If sex felt like connection, if it felt like closeness, if it felt like validation, then of course something casual still felt meaningful. I didn't go into those situations confused. I went in hopeful, hopeful that chemistry would turn into consistency, that physical closeness would eventually grow emotional roots, that if something felt good enough, long enough, right, it would naturally become more. And sometimes it almost does, which is honestly the hardest part, maybe, because those little moments of connection make you think maybe this time it's different. Maybe this one will grow into something more. Maybe I don't need to name it yet. Maybe I'm just being patient. Feel familiar? But when your foundation already ties intimacy to feeling close, hookup culture doesn't feel casual. It feels familiar. And that's when things start to really, really blur, because you're not just navigating attraction anymore, you're navigating expectations you didn't even realize that you were carrying about this person, which is why the shift doesn't happen overnight. You don't wake up one day hating hookup culture. You just start slowly noticing how often it leaves you questioning yourself and everything about you instead of feeling grounded and like light and loved. And that's where it stopped being fun and started being something I needed to look at more honestly. So let's really talk about hookup culture, because this is where things get interesting, in my opinion. On paper, it sounds amazing. Okay. No pressure, no labels, just vibes, baby. Two people having fun, being casual, living their best lives, emotionally unbothered. I mean, that sounds good. That's something that most people would be interested in. And sometimes it really is fun. You meet someone, there's chemistry, you laugh, you feel wanted, it's exciting. And those occasional times do lead into something more, right? You're like, wow, I feel so relaxed. Look at me being modern and emotionally evolved. But then a few weeks pass and suddenly you're rereading texts like they're your ancient scripture you can't understand. You're pretending you don't care when really every text tone you hear makes your heart skip a beat. You start saying things like, I'm totally fine with this, while mentally planning conversations that you're going to have to get him back in your proximity. That's usually the moment when hookup culture stops feeling casual and starts feeling extremely confusing because no one really tells you that casual still involves people. And people have feelings no matter which way you try to spin it. Even the ones who swear that they don't. Usually, especially the ones that swear that they don't. Those are usually the ones that have the most and biggest feelings about all of it. Hookup culture teaches us how to act unbothered, not how to be honest. It teaches you how to keep it light, not how to check in with yourself. And a lot of the time, you don't realize something's off until you're already like super emotionally invested in a situation that never agreed to hold you truthfully or respectfully. And here's the part, in my opinion, that just really doesn't get talked about enough. Women are really good at convincing ourselves we're fine with things we are actually just tolerating or we really care about. We call it being low maintenance. We call it going with the flow. We call it not wanting to be dramatic. But your nervous system doesn't care what label you put on it. If something leaves you anxious, unsure, or questioning your worth, your body notices. And again, this isn't anti fun. This is just pro awareness because hookup culture isn't necessarily the villain. It's the confusing chemistry for emotional safety that gets lumped in there that you're not prepared for. And a lot of us had to learn that the hard way in a really shitty situationship that we're still probably in therapy for, trying to figure out the mess it made of our hearts and our feelings and our understandings of what love actually is. Let's just be honest. The emotional cost is extremely real, not in a dramatic, life ruining kind of way, but in a quiet, like cumulative way. The kind you don't notice until you stop and think, why do I feel so tired of this? Because the cost isn't just heartbreak, it's the slow erosion of your strong clarity of self. The way you start second guessing your intuition when you used to trust it just fine, the way your standards get quieter while your confusion gets louder. For a lot of women, sex doesn't just happen in the body. It's not that simple for us. It lingers in the nervous system. We bond through touch, through closeness, through presence. And even when we tell ourselves it's casual, our bodies do not always catch the memo. And I feel like every single person listening to this can agree. So you end up in this weird in between space trying to act unbothered while feeling deeply impacted and entangled, telling yourself you're fine while also feeling oddly attached to someone who hasn't actually chosen you yet. And again, this isn't about being weak or emotional, it's about being wired for connection. Women are often socialized to be accommodating, to adapt, to hold emotional space. So when something feels off, we don't immediately walk away. It's not in our nature. We explain it, we soften it, we internalize it. We start asking, what's wrong with me? Instead of asking, is this actually working for me? We go inward instead of thinking the problem could possibly be something we're being sold as normal from the outside world. And the longer that goes on, the more disconnected we feel, not just from the other person, but from ourselves. And that's the cost that no one really names. Not that sex is bad, not that casual is wrong, but that repeatedly placing your body in situations your heart hasn't agreed to creates a kind of emotional whiplash. And over time, it adds up. It shows up as anxiety, as numbness, as detachment you didn't actually want, as a low level sadness you can't quite explain. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you were navigating something that asked more of you than it admitted, and you just didn't know. And in this defining moment is usually where perspective starts to change. Again, not overnight, not because someone's telling you you're wrong, because really, who cares? But because it teaches you something you couldn't have understood earlier. As you get older, you stop viewing sex in isolation. You start seeing it in context. You've lived enough to recognize patterns. You've watched chemistry fade. You've seen how desire doesn't always equal devotion. You've felt what it's like to give access to people who never planned to stay. And with that experience comes the purest kind of clarity. A lot of women don't say they wish they would have waited because they think sex is bad now, right? They say it because they understand the cost differently. Or dare I say, they feel the cost differently. They felt how quickly physical closeness can create emotional attachment to someone they should not be attached to. Like when the relationship itself is unstable or undefined or temporary. Waiting starts to look less like restriction and more like protection. Not protection from pleasure, but protection for your peace, your clarity, and your sense of self. Because when you've had enough experiences where sex pulled you deeper into something that wasn't actually good for you, you start craving discernment instead of intensity. You start wanting safety more than sparks, consistency more than chemistry, being chosen more than being desired. And here's the part that's hard to explain to a younger mind. It's not that sex mattered too much back then, it's that it mattered more than you realized. So when women say, I wish I had waited longer, what I believe they're trying to say is, I wish I had known how deeply I would be affected emotionally. That shift doesn't come from being jaded, it comes from being hyper aware. And awareness changes everything. One of the biggest shifts that happens with age and honestly with healing as well is what stability does to your desires. Once you've experienced chaos and inconsistency or emotional whiplash, excitement stops being the goal. Stability changes what feels attractive. You stop craving the highs and the lows. You stop romanticizing unpredictability. You stop confusing anxiety with chemistry. And instead, your desires get quieter, but also much deeper. You start wanting things that don't spike your nervous system. You want to feel safe in someone's presence. You want consistency that doesn't need explaining. You want intimacy that doesn't make you question where you stand afterward. And that doesn't mean passion disappears. It means passion has a foundation. Sex stops being about validation and starts being about real, true connection. It becomes something you share, not something you use to feel chosen. It becomes an extension of trust, not a test of worth. It becomes something that adds to the relationship instead of holding it together. Stability teaches you that desire doesn't have to be urgent to be real. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. It doesn't have to crush you to matter. And once you feel that kind of steadiness, the kind that lets you relax instead of perform, your standards don't get higher in a superficial way. They just get more like drawn out and clear. You're no longer chasing intensity, you're choosing alignment. And that's not boring, it's peaceful. And for a lot of us, it's the first time desire feels sustainable instead of exhausting, which is honestly wild because it means so many of us were taught in one way or another that being desired was the same thing as being valued. And if you're like me, it took a while to realize those two things aren't interchangeable. And this is where reclaiming choice without shame comes right on in. Because this isn't about swinging from one extreme to the other. It's not about saying, I did it wrong, or I should have known better, or I need to be ashamed for my 20s and blah, 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 blah. Because that's not growth. That's just self punishment. Reclaiming choice means realizing you're allowed to change your mind without turning your past into something ugly. You're allowed to decide what feels right now, and not based on who you were trying to impress, not based on what used to make you feel wanted, not based on what everyone else thinks about it. Choice without shame says, I get to decide what I give access to. I get to decide what intimacy looks like for me. I get to decide when something feels aligned and when it does not. Choosing differently now doesn't mean you were wrong then. It means you've just learned. It means you've gathered enough information about yourself to say, I don't want this to cost me the way it used to. That's wisdom, not judgment. Reclaiming choice also means releasing the pressure to explain yourself. You don't owe anyone an explanation on your boundaries. You don't have to justify why something doesn't feel good anymore or why you've changed. You don't have to defend your desire for more meaning and more safety or more intention. And when shame tries to creep in, reminding you of your past and your experiences and your mistakes, this is where you remind yourself shame doesn't get to decide my future. You're not less fun for wanting depth. I mean, if you needed me to say that, you're not uptight for wanting intention. Again, if you need to hear that, there you go. You're not broken for realizing that what once felt freeing started feeling detrimental. You're just choosing yourself now, clearly, consciously, and definitely without apology. I mean, this is the real conversation we probably should have been having all along, right? Not the no, don't do it, wait till marriage, never have sex talk, or, the just be careful, wear a condom talk, but the honest one about how sex interacts with attachment style and identity and self worth over time. Because the truth is, no one told us that you can enjoy something and still decide it's not right for you anymore. No one told us that empowerment doesn't always look the same at every single stage of life. And no one really said, hey, pay attention to how all of this stuff makes you feel after, not just during. This isn't about regret. It's about reflection. It's about realizing that you're allowed to evolve without rewriting your past as a mistake, that you can honor who you were and protect who you're becoming, that your standards aren't a punishment, they're information. And maybe the real growth isn't in swinging between extremes, but in finally giving ourselves permission to listen to what our body and mind and heart all have been telling us for years. Not louder rules, just better awareness. So if this episode feels like it put words to something you've been quietly thinking but never really said out loud, welcome to the in between. You're not late and you're not weird and you're not doing life wrong. You're just growing. And growth doesn't mean you stop being fun or open or curious. It just means you stop ignoring the parts of you that need honesty more than distraction or hype. So, whether you're 21 or 28 or 35 like me, or somewhere on the spectrum of those ages or earlier or older, whatever, if your perspective is shifting, that doesn't mean that you've lost yourself. It usually means you've started making your way back to your true aligned self again. So, if this episode put words to something that you've never named, that matters. So please share it with someone who's learning or unlearning and choosing differently too. Comment your favorite line or just hit the follow button so this small growing community can keep finding its people. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you all more than you could ever know. So keep choosing depth, listen to your body, and don't confuse access with affection. This is Chasing Stability, and I'll meet you in the in between next Tuesday.